Emily had grown used to the silence. It clung to her mornings like a second skin, filling the narrow apartment with a heaviness that no open window could disperse. The early light crept in reluctantly, casting pale stripes across the wooden floor and stopping at the edge of her bed, where she sat with both hands pressed against her swollen belly. The child shifted inside her, a gentle kick against the tender walls of her body. It startled her still, each time, reminding her that she was no longer just herself. There was another life, small and unformed, listening in on her every thought, responding to her moods as though the baby already knew her better than anyone else. On the dresser across from her sat a framed photograph, her wedding day. Leonard, tall and composed, stood beside her, one arm wrapped around her waist, the other hand holding hers with such assurance that day. People had envied the way he looked at her, the way he leaned in as if nothing else existed. But this morning, Emily studied the photo long enough to notice what she had ignored before. Leonard's hand seemed too tight, his smile too perfect, as if already rehearsed. She wondered if the seed of his departure had been sown even then. Word of his appearance at the city's most prestigious auction had reached her the day before. He would not come alone. Whispers spread quickly. Leonard, hand in hand with the woman who had taken Emily's place. They would sit in the front, they would draw cameras, they would bask in the admiration of a world quick to forget. Emily had no tears left for this knowledge. She had spent them months ago, when Leonard's lies first turned into truths she could no longer deny. Now all that remained was the silence, a kind of resignation that coated her voice, her gestures, her very being. That morning, Julian came. He did not knock loudly, just a soft rap at the door, followed by the sound of it easing open. Julian always carried himself like a man conscious of other people's wounds. He filled the room not with words, but with presence. Solid, unhurried, careful. "May I?" he asked, though he was already inside. Emily nodded. He set down a small envelope on the table between them. No grand gestures, no speeches, just that quiet offering. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was an invitation, one that guaranteed she would not walk into that hall alone. She looked up at him, searching his face. His eyes did not carry pity nor judgment, only recognition, as if he too knew what it was to be left behind by life, to be hollowed out and forced to keep moving. The child stirred again inside her. She pressed her hand against the curve of her belly, as though reassuring the baby, as though whispering, "We are not alone." "Why would you do this?" Her voice cracked slightly, the question escaping before she could stop it. Julian sat across from her, his hands folded loosely in his lap. Because no one should face that kind of room alone. There was no promise in his words, no suggestion that he would erase her pain. He simply named it, and in naming it, made it lighter somehow. Emily realized she had not heard such honesty in a very long time. Still, fear clung to her. The thought of walking into that auction, of seeing Leonard's face turned toward another woman, was unbearable. Yet some part of her knew it was necessary. Wounds left untouched grew deeper in the dark. To look at him once more, to stand in his presence and not collapse, would be a way of reclaiming something she had lost. Later, as Julian left, he paused at the doorway. "You don't have to decide now, but if you come, I'll be there." Emily nodded, though her chest tightened with dread. When the door closed behind him, she leaned back against her chair, eyes shut. The envelope lay on the table like a stone, heavy with choice. Outside, the city stirred awake. She heard the distant hum of traffic, the barking of a dog, the faint cry of a vendor calling out bread. Life moved on, indifferent to her grief. Her hand returned to her belly, tracing slow circles. "We'll be all right," she whispered, though her voice carried no certainty. For the rest of the day, Emily moved through her rooms like a shadow. Every sound reminded her of the silence Leonard had left behind. Every glance at the mirror showed her a woman she barely recognized. She remembered the nights he returned late, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, his excuses layered and polished until she almost believed them. She remembered the morning he finally confessed, not with shame, but with the cool efficiency of a man closing a business deal. Now, with the baby inside her, those memories cut deeper. It was not just her own betrayal. It was the knowledge that her child would one day carry the story of a father who chose elsewhere. That pain pressed against her ribs, sharper than any knife. By evening, she found herself at the window again. The photograph of their wedding still stood on the dresser, and she considered taking it down. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the knowledge that erasing the past would not change its truth. Perhaps it was the faint, stubborn belief that one day she would look at that photo without breaking. The envelope remained on the table. She had not opened it again, but its presence filled the room. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would decide. For now, she let the silence hold her, as it always had. And in that silence, she felt both the weight of her loneliness and the fragile stirrings of something else. Something like strength, though she did not yet dare to name it. Emily lay awake long after the city had gone to sleep. The ceiling above her blurred in the half-light, painted by the glow of street lamps outside. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind circled back to that envelope on the table. It waited for her like a challenge, heavy with meaning, a door she wasn't sure she was ready to open. The child stirred again, a sharp kick beneath her ribs. She winced and whispered, "I know, little one, I know." It felt like the baby had a voice of its own, pressing her to make a choice, to step forward instead of drowning in silence. Memories of Leonard came uninvited. The sound of his laughter that once filled their kitchen, rich and easy. The way he used to rest his hand absent-mindedly on her lower back when they walked through crowded rooms, as though to remind her she belonged beside him. That intimacy had vanished long before the mistress appeared. Looking back, Emily wondered if it had been fading from the start, like paint peeling slowly from a wall, until one day the cracks were too wide to ignore. When dawn arrived, she rose and pressed her palm against the window pane. The streets below were slick with rain from the night before. Delivery trucks rumbled past. A vendor set up a small stall on the corner, unfolding an umbrella of faded red cloth. Life outside pulsed with rhythm, as though urging her to join it. She bathed, dressed carefully in a pale blue dress that still fit her swollen form, and brushed her hair back into a low knot. She lingered at the mirror, studying the faint circles beneath her eyes, the softness of her face that pregnancy had carved. She looked different now, and she wondered if Leonard would recognize her. Not only the body, but the woman who had emerged from months of betrayal and silence. At noon, Julian's car pulled up. He didn't send for her with anyone else. He came himself, stepping out in a charcoal suit, polished but understated. His presence filled the doorway before he spoke. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Emily looked down at her shoes, then back up. The word no lingered on her tongue, but she swallowed it. Yes. Inside the car, silence stretched between them, comfortable in its own way. She stared out at the passing city. Buildings with their mirrored glass, mothers pulling children across crosswalks, young men smoking on corners. Everyone lived within their own story, unaware of hers. Julian broke the quiet. "When you walk in today, the cameras will try to devour you. They'll search for weakness, for cracks in your armor. But remember, this isn't their story to write. It's yours." Emily let the words sink in. "And if I fall apart?" "Then you fall apart," he said, eyes fixed on the road. "But at least you will have faced them. There is dignity in that." She pressed her hands over her belly, trying to borrow strength from his calm certainty. The auction hall rose ahead, its facade gleaming white against the gray sky. A banner stretched across the entrance, letters bold and proud, announcing an event where fortunes would change hands like trinkets. Crowds clustered on the steps, their voices weaving into a low hum of anticipation. The car slowed. Emily's breath caught. Julian placed a hand lightly over hers, one step at a time. The door opened, and for a moment the world paused. Photographers shifted, lenses turning, murmurs rising. Emily stepped onto the pavement, her heels clicking against stone. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and expensive perfume. Julian fell into step beside her, his tall frame a steady shadow at her side. Together they moved toward the entrance, the crowd parting instinctively. Some faces turned in curiosity, others in recognition. And then she saw them. Leonard. Taller than she remembered, or perhaps just more imposing in the harsh light of the cameras. His hand rested possessively at the small of another woman's back. The mistress, young and radiant in a glittering emerald gown. She leaned into him with the ease of someone certain of her place. They looked up at the same moment, and their eyes met hers. The world sharpened into painful clarity. Emily's chest tightened. Her throat ached with the weight of everything unsaid. The mistress's lips curved into a smile, half triumph, half taunt. Leonard's face flickered, his jaw stiffening, his eyes narrowing, as though he hadn't expected her here, hadn't believed she had the courage to show. Julian's presence was her anchor. He didn't touch her, didn't draw attention, but his nearness kept her from crumbling. They passed into the hall. Crystal chandeliers glimmered above rows of seats lined with velvet. The air buzzed with whispers, speculation rushing through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Emily felt their stares burn into her back, their voices stitching her name into gossip. She sat beside Julian in the front row, directly across from Leonard and the mistress. The space between them was thick with unshed years. The auctioneer mounted the stage, his gavel gleaming under the lights. He spoke in polished tones about rare art and priceless collections, but Emily barely heard him. She could feel Leonard's gaze, sharp as a blade against her skin. Her hand found her stomach again. The child shifted, restless as though sharing her turmoil. Julian leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough only for her. "Remember, you are not here to prove anything to him. You're here to remember yourself." Emily closed her eyes for a breath, letting the words fill the cracks where fear leaked in. When she opened them again, she caught Leonard's stare. And for the first time she didn't look away. The mistress whispered something into his ear, and he forced a smile, brittle at the edges. Emily felt a small flicker of power stir within her, a flame she hadn't known still burned. The auctioneer raised the first piece, a painting bathed in light. The hall fell silent. But for Emily, the true battle had already begun. The gavel struck once, the sound echoing like a crack of thunder across the chamber. The auctioneer's voice rose with practiced rhythm, numbers spilling into the air, rich and fluid. Wealth shifted hands with every nod of the head, every subtle raise of a paddle. Emily sat stiffly, her body upright, but her heart caving inward. The velvet seat beneath her felt unsteady, as though it might sink beneath the weight of her history. She pressed her knees together, her palms folded on her lap, one hand always close to her belly. Leonard's laughter drifted across the aisle. It was low, controlled, meant to sound effortless. But Emily knew him too well. She heard the tension tucked inside it, the quiver of a man trying to mask his discomfort. The mistress whispered in his ear, her earrings glinting under the lights, her smile deliberate as though she wanted the room to memorize her triumph. Emily wondered if the young woman knew the cost of that triumph. If she understood the hollowness of being chosen by a man who once promised eternity to another and broke it like a fragile ornament. Perhaps she did not care. Perhaps all that mattered was the shine of tonight. Julian shifted beside her, crossing one leg over the other. He leaned back slightly, calm as stone in a river. Emily stole a glance at him. His profile was sharp beneath the glow of chandeliers, his expression unreadable. He did not play to the crowd. He did not seek to crush Leonard with gestures or spectacle. His strength was quieter, but it filled the space around him like an invisible wall. The auctioneer lifted a sculpture, a modern piece of metal twisted into unfamiliar shapes. Bids erupted, paddles rose and fell. Numbers climbed with a feverish pace. Emily blinked, feeling distant, her mind wandering to a different time. She remembered the first time Leonard had taken her to an auction. She had been nervous then too, but for other reasons. He had pressed her hand and whispered that she belonged with him, that the room was theirs to command. She had believed him, had looked at him with trust so deep it blinded her. How strange, she thought now, that the same setting could hold two such different versions of her life, one full of promise, the other heavy with loss. Her breath came uneven, shallow. She could almost feel her younger self sitting somewhere in the hall, watching her, asking, "How did we come to this?" Julian's hand brushed hers, so slight she almost thought she imagined it. But when she turned, he was looking at her with a gaze steady and anchoring. She didn't smile, but the tremor in her chest eased. The auction continued, piece after piece, voices rising, prices soaring. Yet Emily's mind remained fixed on the magnetic pull of Leonard's stare. He was watching her again, his expression dark, unreadable. Not pride, not love, not even anger, something else. Perhaps a realization that she had come not as the abandoned wife, but as someone who no longer hid in shadows. The mistress leaned closer, her painted lips parting against his ear. Emily looked away. She could not bear the intimacy of it, the counterfeit tenderness displayed so brazenly. The child inside her kicked hard. She pressed a hand against her side, drawing a slow breath. The pain was sharp, but beneath it she felt a peculiar clarity. This moment was no longer about Leonard or the woman at his side. It was about surviving the storm without letting it strip her bare. The auctioneer raised his voice for the centerpiece of the night. A painting, vast and luminous, depicting a solitary figure walking down a deserted street at dusk. The figure's shoulders were hunched, his shadow stretched long behind him. Something about it pierced Emily's chest. She felt her throat tighten as though the painting had found her secret and laid it bare. Julian raised his paddle. The room shifted, attention snapping to him. Numbers climbed swiftly, rival bids rising in waves, but he did not falter. His calm presence seemed to unsettle others. The final strike of the gavel sealed it. Julian had won. Applause scattered like rain on stone. Emily sat frozen, staring at the painting being carried away. "Why that one?" she asked quietly. Julian's eyes did not leave the stage. "Because it reminds me that loneliness can be turned into strength, that even in the emptiest street, one can keep walking." Emily turned the words over in her mind. They felt like he pressed into her palm, though she was not yet ready to use it. Leonard shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. His mistress looked less triumphant now, her smile slipping. Something in Julian's victory had unsettled them. Emily caught his glance again, and this time she did not flinch. The auction wound down. People rose, conversations bloomed, laughter spilled into the air. The hall became a hive of movement and sound. Emily stood slowly, the world tilting slightly as she rose. Julian steadied her with a hand near her elbow, gentle, not possessive. Together they moved toward the exit, their steps measured. Behind them, Leonard's voice called her name. Just once. Firm, low, urgent. Emily froze. The sound of it carried her back through years. Nights when he had spoken her name with tenderness, mornings when it was spoken with impatience. Now it was something else, a plea or a warning. She couldn't tell. She did not turn. Her hand tightened on Julian's arm. The air between them thickened, each second heavy as stone. Julian leaned close enough that only she could hear. "You don't owe him anything." Emily closed her eyes for the briefest moment, steadying herself. When she opened them, she stepped forward. The doors loomed ahead, sunlight spilling through their glass panes. Each stride carried her further from Leonard's voice, further from the woman who once belonged to him. And as the doors swung open, Emily felt the weight of tomorrow pressing upon her. Daunting, uncertain, but hers at last. The doors shut behind them with a muted thud, muffling the hum of voices inside. Outside, the night air wrapped around Emily like a shawl of cool silk. The stars were hidden by the city's glow, but the wind carried a freshness she had not tasted in years. Julian guided her gently down the steps, his hand near her elbow, though he let her carry her own weight. The marble beneath her heels was cold and firm, steady in a way her heart was not. Behind them, the sound came again. Leonard's voice. It cut through the night more sharply than the wind. Emily. The name, once a tender word, now sounded jagged, raw. She stopped on the steps, her body caught between past and present. Julian did not move, only watched her with eyes that spoke. "This choice is yours, not his." Emily turned. Leonard stood in the doorway, the mistress slightly behind him, her hand hooked at his arm as if claiming him before the world. The lights from the hall fell on them, painting their faces with gold. To others they might have looked magnificent, but to Emily it was a strange, hollow image, a man clinging to dignity, a woman to illusion. "You didn't answer me," Leonard said. His voice carried, though he kept it low. "Why are you here?" Emily studied him. She remembered the curve of that jawline, once soft against her cheek, now hard with tension. She remembered the same eyes that once looked at her like she was the only one in the room. Now they darted restless, not from love but from fear of losing ground. "I was invited," she said, her voice steady though her chest trembled. Julian remained silent beside her, a presence both protective and patient. Leonard laughed, short and sharp. "By him? Is this your idea of revenge? To walk in on my world, on my night with—" He gestured toward Julian. "With another man holding your leash?" Emily felt the sting, not because the words were true, but because once she might have believed them. Once she might have crumbled under his accusation, but tonight something deeper anchored her. She let the silence stretch long enough that even Leonard shifted under it. "I came," she said slowly, "because I no longer belong to your world, Leonard. Not your knight, not your leash, not your lies." The mistress stiffened, her smile faltering. Leonard's face flushed, the color rising like fire. "You're carrying my child," he hissed, stepping closer. "Don't forget that." Emily's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The child kicked, as though in answer. Her throat tightened, but she stood her ground. "This child is mine to protect," she said softly, "not yours to use." The words left her mouth like a whisper, but they carried the weight of years. Julian's eyes flickered, a faint nod, approval in the smallest gesture. Leonard froze, caught in a web he did not expect. His mistress tugged at his sleeve, whispering something sharp. His gaze dropped, then lifted again, searching Emily's face for weakness. Finding none, he spat the air with silence. Emily turned away. The night stretched before her, the city humming with indifferent life. She stepped down the last stair, Julian's stride steady beside hers. They reached the car. Julian opened the door, but before she entered, she paused. The glass reflected her face, pale, tired, yet marked with a quiet defiance she had not seen before. Inside, the car smelled faintly of leather and cedar. She sank into the seat, resting her head against the window. As the engine hummed, the auction hall shrank behind them, its lights fading into the distance. But Leonard's voice lingered in her ears, echoing through corridors of memory. "You're carrying my child." She closed her eyes. Images flooded. Leonard's hands once cradling her shoulders, his laughter across a dinner table, his promises whispered against her skin. Each memory carried both tenderness and betrayal, interwoven like threads she could no longer untangle. Julian's voice broke through the silence. "You don't have to see him again if you don't want to." Emily opened her eyes, the city lights sliding across the glass. "But I will, won't I? At the birth, at the papers. He won't let go so easily." Julian studied her profile, the curve of her cheek against the night. "Then we prepare, not for him, but for you, for your child." The word "your" clung to her, like a balm. Not his, not even ours. Hers. They drove in silence for a while. The city thinned, giving way to quieter streets, trees swaying under the moonlight. Emily's hand never left her belly. The child moved gently now, as if soothed by the rhythm of the road. Her mind drifted. She thought of the years with Leonard, the rise and fall, the grand gestures, the slow erosion. She thought of the mistress, a mirror of herself once, eager, believing. She thought of Julian, his silence more powerful than Leonard's accusations. By the time they reached Julian's estate on the outskirts of the city, the night had deepened. The gates opened without a sound, and the car rolled into a drive lined with lanterns. The house stood tall, its windows glowing warmly, as if it had been waiting just for her. Inside, the air was quiet, filled with the faint crackle of a fire. Julian led her to a chair by the hearth. She sat, exhaustion washing over her like a tide. He poured tea, placed the cup before her, and sat across without words. The flames danced in silence, throwing shadows against the walls. Emily lifted the cup, its warmth seeping into her palms. She took a sip, bitter at first, then soothing. For the first time in years, she felt the possibility of rest, not in sleep, but in the idea that tomorrow might not hurt as much as today. Julian's voice came low, gentle. "You're stronger than you think." Emily looked into the fire, the words lodging somewhere deep inside. She did not answer. She only held her belly, felt the pulse of life beneath her hand, and let the silence cradle her. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing red against the stone hearth. Emily sat still, the cup empty in her hands, though her fingers lingered as if they could draw warmth from porcelain that had long cooled. Her eyes traced the shifting shadows on the wall, shadows that seemed to tell stories of the past, stories she could not escape. Julian had left her there, not with abandonment, but with a kind of respect. He seemed to understand she needed solitude, not answers. Upstairs she heard the muffled creak of the house settling, the occasional whisper of wind against the glass. Her hand moved again to her belly. The child stirred beneath her skin, a faint ripple like wings against the inside of her womb. It both comforted and unsettled her. "You are mine, and yet you are his too," she thought. The thought felt like a betrayal of its own, and guilt washed over her. She whispered aloud, though no one was near. I won't let him use you, not like he used me." The words dissolved in the quiet, yet saying them aloud planted them like seeds. She rose from the chair, her body heavy but her steps steady, and wandered to the window. Outside, the grounds stretched wide, lanterns dimming under the moonlight. The estate carried an air of permanence, roots sunk deep into the earth, walls that had seen generations pass. It was nothing like the fragile glass towers Leonard had always built around them, where everything glittered until it shattered. Julian returned quietly, his presence filling the room before his footsteps did. He carried a folded blanket. Without speaking, he draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but Emily felt something stir, an ache, almost, for what kindness could have been all along. "You should rest," he said softly. "I can't," she replied. "Not tonight." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. He sat across from her, hands clasped loosely, gaze fixed not on her but on the fire. It was a silence without pressure, the kind that allowed her thoughts to unfurl rather than coil tighter. After a long while, she said, "When he spoke tonight, when he called out my name, I felt as if all the years folded back on me, as if I was still the girl who ran into his arms believing they would hold forever." Julian's head tilted slightly, but he did not interrupt. "And yet," she continued, her voice low, "when I answered him, I was not her anymore. I don't know when that girl vanished. Maybe the first time he left me waiting at a table until midnight. Maybe the night he came home reeking of perfume that wasn't mine. Or maybe when I learned I was carrying this child and realized I would have to face it alone." Her throat tightened and she pressed a hand against her lips, holding back the tide of tears. Julian's voice came calm, a low current. "She did not vanish. She grew. You think of her as lost, but she is here. She is you, only stronger, wiser, unwilling to bow again." Emily looked at him, his words catching her unguarded. Something in her chest shifted, as though his voice had reached a place long sealed. She turned away, unable to meet his gaze, and asked quietly, "Why do you help me? You owe me nothing. You could have left me in that hall to stand alone." Julian leaned back, his eyes still steady on the fire. "I help because I choose to, and because I know what it is to be silenced by someone who believes they own you." The words surprised her. She searched his face for further meaning, but he gave none. Only the flicker of the flames reflected in his eyes. She wondered what ghosts haunted him, but did not press. The hours slipped by. Eventually, she allowed herself to be guided to a guest room. The bed was wide, the sheets cool, the air carrying a faint scent of lavender. As she lay down, the silence pressed heavier than any words. Sleep came fitfully. Dreams rose like smoke. Images of Leonard's face, the mistress's smirk, the child's tiny hands reaching. She woke more than once, her body damp with sweat, the moonlight silver across the floor. Each time, she pressed her palm to her belly, whispering promises she could not yet define. By morning, her eyes were shadowed, but her resolve clearer. She descended to the kitchen, where Julian sat already with papers spread before him. He looked up briefly, offered a nod, then returned to the documents. The smell of coffee filled the air. "You didn't sleep," he observed, not as a question. "No," she admitted. He slid a cup toward her. She wrapped her hands around it, though she barely drank. Her mind circled back to Leonard's words from the night before. "You're carrying my child." They clung to her like burrs she could not shake. Finally, she spoke. "He will fight for this child, not for love, never for love, but for control. He cannot bear the thought of me having something without him." Julian set down his pen, his gaze met hers, unwavering. "Then you must be ready to fight back, not with his weapons, rage, pride, possession, but with your own." "And what are mine?" she asked, almost bitterly. "Truth," Julian replied. "Strength, the kind that does not shout but stands." Emily felt the words settle into her, heavy but steady. She realized then that the silence she had carried for so long was not weakness. It was a shield, one she could now wield differently. The day stretched ahead. Outside, the estate bloomed under the sun, birdsong threading through the air. But inside, Emily knew the war had only begun. She traced the rim of her cup, the warmth fading. "Then teach me," she whispered. "Teach me how to stand." Julian's lips curved faintly, not into triumph but into something quieter, recognition perhaps. "You already have," he said. "Last night, when you faced him, that was the first step." Emily closed her eyes, the memory returning. Leonard's face, stunned not by her fury but by her refusal to yield. It was not victory yet, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings were enough. Morning light fell across the table, pale and cool, as if even the sun hesitated to touch the corners of Emily's heart. She sat with her hands wrapped around the coffee cup, untouched, her gaze unfocused on the steam rising and vanishing. The estate around her carried a rhythm of its own. Servants moving quietly, the sound of horses in the stables, the distant toll of a church bell. Life continued, indifferent to the ruin or rebirth of one woman. Julian remained across from her, not crowding her, not pressing her with words. His stillness unsettled her at times. It made her confront herself. Leonard had always filled silence with his voice, his plans, his charm. Julian let silence expand until Emily could not escape her own thoughts. Finally, she set the cup down. He won't stop, you know that. Julian's eyes lifted from the papers before him, calm, steady, unblinking. Yes. And she faltered. The truth caught in her throat, bitter. I don't know if I have it in me to face him again. Every time I think of his voice, his smile, I feel small, as if I am already defeated. Julian leaned forward, folding the papers aside, his voice measured. That is what he counts on, that you will shrink, that your silence will be his victory. Emily flinched. She had lived years in that silence. She had mistaken endurance for loyalty, mistaken her quiet suffering as strength. Now she saw how it had been twisted into submission. I don't know who I am without that silence, she confessed. Her hands tightened against each other, fingers pale. Julian considered her for a moment, then said, You are the woman who stood before him last night and did not bow. That is who you are. The silence you carried was not your prison, it was your preparation. Now it can be your weapon. His words lingered, shaping something inside her. She remembered the hall, the way Leonard's eyes had widened, not at her tears, but at her refusal to crumble. For the first time, she had seen fear flicker in him. Emily rose, restless, walking toward the tall windows. The garden stretched green and endless, the roses in bloom, petals trembling in the morning air. She pressed her palm to the glass, the cool surface grounding her. My father once told me, she said slowly, that dignity is not what others grant you. It's what you refuse to surrender. I think I forgot that. Julian's voice came, quiet but certain. Then remember now, and hold fast to it. You cannot take what you will not give. She turned, the light catching the shadows beneath her eyes. But what of the child? He will use the courts, the wealth, the lies. He will paint me unfit, fragile, broken. And perhaps, her voice dropped, raw. Perhaps he will not be wrong. I am fragile. I am afraid. Julian rose then, crossing the room until he stood near, not too close, but close enough that his presence felt like a wall against the world. Fear does not make you unfit. It makes you human. And fragility, do not mistake it. Glass may break, but it also reflects light no stone can. Emily swallowed hard. His words were not promises of safety. They were heavier, demanding she see herself differently. Why do you say these things? She asked. Why do you give me more faith than I can give myself? Julian looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a recognition so deep it unnerved her. Because I have seen what happens when silence wins, and I will not watch it claim you too. The room thickened with unspoken truths. Emily turned back to the window, the sunlight now stronger, pressing through. Hours later she walked alone through the gardens. Gravel crunched beneath her shoes, the scent of roses carried on the wind. The child shifted inside her, a reminder that every step forward was no longer hers alone. She felt the weight of legacy, the kind Leonard wanted to control, the kind she now vowed to protect. At the far edge of the garden stood a marble bench, weathered by rain and time. She lowered herself carefully, resting her hands over her belly. She thought of the stories she would one day tell this child. Stories not of betrayal, but of endurance. Not of silence, but of voice. Her mind drifted to the nights Leonard had returned late, eyes glazed with champagne, laughter clinging to him like perfume. She had waited then, heart pounding, hoping for a word, a touch, anything to remind her she still mattered. The silence of those nights had nearly broken her. Now she realized it had shaped her resolve. By the time she returned to the house, a new stillness had settled in her. Not the silence of despair, but of determination. She found Julian in the library, surrounded by shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes. He looked up, his expression unchanged but his eyes searching. "I need to learn," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Learn what?" "How to fight him. Not as he fights, but as I must." Julian set his book aside, his face unreadable. "Then we begin." And so they did. Days stretched into a rhythm. In the mornings, Emily studied documents, histories of battles not fought with swords, but with law and will. Julian taught her where power lay, not in shouting but in standing, not in fury but in clarity. In the afternoons she walked, her body carrying both the weight of life and the weight of choice. By evening she wrote, her words spilling onto paper, letters she never sent, confessions she might never speak, but through which she discovered the shape of her own voice. Nights still brought dreams, heavy and relentless. But now, when she woke, she did not tremble as before. She sat upright, steady, listening to the heartbeat inside her, whispering to the child, "We will not be owned. We will not bow." Julian watched her quietly in those days, his presence unwavering. He did not push, did not claim, did not try to rewrite her wounds. He simply stood near enough that she knew she was not alone. And in that knowing, Emily began to breathe differently. Deeper. Freer. She realized then that her silence had never been the end of her story. It was the space before the voice rose. And soon, it would. The rain arrived with little warning. It swept across the estate in sheets, tapping on windows, darkening the skies, and washing the roses until their petals bent under the weight. Emily stood at the threshold of the library, listening to the rhythm of it, feeling the storm echo inside her chest. Julian had left for a meeting in the city, promising to return before nightfall. Alone, Emily wandered the rooms, her footsteps soft on polished wood. She had begun to notice how silence no longer suffocated her. It accompanied her. She walked with it like an old companion, steady and unjudging. On the desk lay documents Julian had left for her. Court precedents, testimonies, evidence of Leonard's dealings that, if brought into light, could alter everything. Emily traced her finger over the names and dates. Each line felt like a weight, a history of betrayal, not only to her but to others. Business partners misled, workers underpaid, charities cheated. Leonard had built his empire not on brilliance, but on deception, stitched together with charm. Yet the thought of standing in a courtroom, of facing him, still filled her with unease. She saw again his smile, that disarming curve of lips he had once turned on her so often. She could hear his laughter, the kind that made others lean closer, desperate to share in his warmth. She had been one of them once. Her hand trembled over the papers. Could she really stand against him? The child shifted within her, as if answering. She pressed her palm to her belly, whispering softly, "I must." That night, Julian returned soaked, his coat dripping water, his hair dark against his forehead. Emily hurried to fetch a towel, and as he dried himself, she caught a rare sight, fatigue in his face, the kind of weariness that spoke of battles fought for too long. "What did you find?" she asked. Julian's eyes met hers, sharp even in exhaustion. "Enough. Enough to strip him of the mask he wears in public. But it will not be easy. Men like Leonard rarely fall cleanly. They drag others down with them." Emily sat beside him, the storm still raging outside, shadows dancing across the walls. "Then we prepare to be dragged, but we will not drown." He looked at her, a flicker of something like pride in his gaze. "You speak as if the fight is already yours." She breathed deeply. "Because it must be. For too long I lived waiting for someone else to decide my worth. Now, if I do not decide it myself, I will lose everything. My child, my dignity, the truth of who I am." Julian said nothing, but in the silence between them, she felt a quiet vow. He would not let her face this storm alone. Days unfolded like chapters of a book she had never meant to write. Mornings were filled with study, afternoons with meetings Julian arranged, lawyers, advocates, even women who had once stood where Emily now stood. They shared their stories, some broken, some triumphant, all marked by scars. Emily listened, her heart tightening at the common thread. Men who believed silence equaled ownership, and women who had found at great cost that silence could also break chains. One evening, as the rain finally ceased and the garden glistened under twilight, Emily sat with an older woman named Margaret. Her hands were thin, veins like rivers beneath her skin, but her voice carried an unshakable steel. "He will try to make you doubt yourself," Margaret said. "He will call you fragile, unstable, unfit. Let him. The truth does not tremble when a liar speaks. Remember that. Emily nodded, words lodging in her heart like anchors. Later, as she walked back through the halls, she caught her reflection in a mirror. For a moment, she did not recognize herself. There was no makeup, no jewelry, just a woman with tired eyes, hair loose, shoulders squared. And yet, there was strength there. A quiet, unyielding strength. She whispered to the reflection, "You are enough." The night brought dreams again. Leonard appeared, his laughter filling vast rooms, his hand gripping hers with the same force it once had. But when she looked closer, she saw his reflection in the dream's mirror, and it was hollow, eyes dark, smile brittle. She woke gasping, but this time she did not tremble. She sat upright, whispered to the sleeping world around her, "I see you now, and I will not bow." Weeks passed, and soon the summons came. Court papers, heavy with seal and ink, announcing what Julian had warned her of. Leonard was moving to claim custody, questioning her fitness as a mother. The blow landed sharp, but Emily did not collapse. Instead, she walked to the window, held her belly, and breathed. She had expected this. The storm was here. When Julian entered the room, she handed him the papers without a word. He read them, jaw tightening, then looked at her. "Are you ready?" Her voice was soft, but steady. "Yes." The days leading to the hearing blurred into a storm of preparation. Witnesses, affidavits, pages of arguments. But beneath the noise, Emily held to a quiet center. Every morning she returned to the marble bench in the garden, whispering to the child within, "We will not be owned. We will not bow." On the morning of the hearing, she rose before dawn. The estate was hushed, the air cool, carrying the scent of wet earth. She dressed simply, a dark dress that did not announce wealth but dignity. In the mirror, she looked once more at herself. The fragile girl who had once waited at the window for Leonard's return was gone. In her place stood a woman with steady eyes, her silence no longer submission but steel. Julian waited at the door. He offered his arm, but Emily shook her head gently. "I must walk this on my own." He inclined his head, respect glimmering in his gaze, and so she did. As the car pulled away, the estate shrinking behind them, Emily pressed her hand once more to her belly. The city awaited, the courtroom awaited, Leonard awaited. Fear pulsed in her veins, sharp and unrelenting. But alongside it was something stronger, resolve. The storm had gathered. Now she would walk into its heart. The courthouse loomed like a gray sentinel against the morning sky, its columns tall and unyielding, as though carved to withstand centuries of storms. Emily stepped from the car, her shoes meeting the slick pavement, the air carrying a faint bite of winter though spring had not yet ended. The city hummed around her, horns blaring, voices weaving through the streets, yet in her chest there was only silence, a hollow pause before the plunge. Julian walked beside her, his presence steady, but Emily did not take his arm. She carried herself upright, her hands clasped over the swell of her belly, as if to shield both herself and the child from the weight of the day. Inside, the halls stretched wide, filled with the murmur of footsteps and hushed conversations. Marble floors reflected the pale light filtering through high windows. Emily caught glimpses of other women waiting with their lawyers, men in suits carrying folders heavy with stories of betrayal and conflict. It struck her then, how many lives intersected in these walls, how many battles were fought beneath the same indifferent ceiling. When Leonard arrived, the air shifted. His charm preceded him like a fragrance sprayed too thickly, cloying rather than inviting. He wore a tailored navy suit, a tie that gleamed faintly. His smile, perfected over years of practice, spread easily across his face as if this were another gala, another stage upon which he could perform. At his side was Clara, draped in pale silk, her hand curled around his arm, her eyes sharp with something like victory. Emily's breath caught, not because of jealousy, it had long since burned to ash, but because of how rehearsed it all looked. Leonard the gallant, Clara the supportive partner, a tableau arranged for the world. Their eyes met across the hall. For a flicker of a moment, she saw a shadow in his smile, a stiffness in the curve of his jaw. Perhaps he had not expected her to stand so tall, so calm. Perhaps he had imagined her wilted, shrunken, begging. She inclined her head slightly, not in greeting but in acknowledgement, as one might to a rival who could no longer be ignored. The courtroom itself was smaller than Emily had imagined, more intimate. its walls lined with wood that smelled faintly of polish and age. The judge sat elevated, her expression composed, eyes sharp. Lawyers shuffled papers, voices rising and falling in procedural rhythm. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table, Julian to her right, their attorney to her left. Across from them, Leonard leaned back in his chair as though the outcome were already scripted in his favor. Clara sat just behind him, her gaze cutting like glass whenever Emily's eyes strayed near. The proceedings began with formality, words heavy with legal cadence. Petitions, counter-petitions, declarations. Leonard's lawyer spoke first, weaving a portrait of Emily as fragile, emotionally unstable, unfit to raise a child alone. His words dripped with practiced politeness, a veneer over the cruelty of their intent. Emily's hands tightened in her lap. She could feel the blood rush in her ears, a storm pressing against her ribs. But she remembered Margaret's words. The truth does not tremble when a liar speaks. She forced her breathing steady, lifting her chin. When her own lawyer rose, the tone shifted. He presented evidence Julian had unearthed, financial inconsistencies, testimonies of Leonard's manipulations, even a charitable fund siphoned for personal indulgence. With each revelation, Leonard's jaw clenched tighter, though he masked it with the occasional smirk. Emily's heart pounded as documents were handed to the judge, each page a shard of truth that might pierce the mask Leonard wore. She glanced toward him once, and for the first time she saw his eyes darken. Not with anger, but with recognition. She was not playing his game anymore. When the recess came, Emily stepped outside into a narrow courtyard. The sun had broken through the clouds, spilling light across the stone benches. She sat, pressing her palms to the cool surface, breathing in the fragile calm. Leonard approached, leaving Clara behind. His footsteps were unhurried, his shadows stretching long before him. "You've changed," he said quietly, almost admiringly. Emily did not look at him. "Or maybe I've always been this way, and you never cared to see it." He chuckled, low and dismissive. "Do you think parading your little evidence will undo me? You don't know how these things work, Emily. The world favors men who can smile while twisting the knife." Her eyes lifted to meet his then, steady, unflinching. "Then let the world watch as you smile. I will not bow." Something flickered across his face, a flash of irritation, quickly masked. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper meant only for her. "Careful, you're playing with fire." She leaned back, her tone calm. "I've already walked through fire. What else can you burn?" For a long moment they held each other's gaze, two histories colliding in the silence between heartbeats. Then Leonard straightened, adjusted his cufflinks, and returned to the hall. Back inside, the afternoon dragged on. Witnesses were called. Voices filled the chamber. Some spoke of Leonard's charm, others of his questionable deals. Emily herself was asked to testify. She rose, her legs trembling slightly, but when she spoke, her voice carried. She told the court of nights spent waiting, of bank accounts emptied while he dined in Paris, of promises made and broken. She did not cry, though her throat ached with the effort. She spoke not as a victim, but as a woman telling the truth. As she stepped down, she caught Julian's gaze. There was no pity there, only respect, fierce and unwavering. The session ended as the sun dipped low, painting the courthouse steps in amber light. Emily walked out slowly, each step heavier than the last, yet inside she felt strangely lighter. The storm had not broken, but she had stood within it. Outside, reporters waited, cameras flashing like sudden lightning. Leonard smiled for them, arm around Clara, his voice smooth as silk. He painted himself the devoted father, the wronged husband, the protector. And for a moment, Emily felt the weight of his performance press against her chest. But then she felt Julian's hand at her back, steady and grounding. She did not look at the cameras. She did not need to. Because for the first time she realized the fight was not about convincing the world. It was about refusing to be erased. That night, as she lay in the quiet of her room, the child turned within her, restless as though echoing her turmoil. Emily placed her hands over her belly and whispered, "We are still here. We are still standing." And in that whisper, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not victory, not yet, but possibility. The morning after court, the world no longer felt like her own. Emily woke to the shrill ring of her phone, the screen lit with notifications, messages from friends, colleagues, even strangers. News outlets had picked up the case. their headlines dancing across digital front pages. Millionaire Leonard Hayes faces allegations of financial misconduct amid custody battle. She sat up slowly, pressing her hand against her belly. The child shifted inside, as though disturbed by the static of it all. On the bedside table, the newspapers Julian had brought over lay unopened, their ink still damp. She did not need to read them. She could feel the words pressing against the walls of her house like an intruder at the door. Julian arrived later that morning, his presence carrying with it a sense of calm Emily had begun to lean upon. He set down a tray of tea, the steam curling upward. "They're painting him two ways," Julian said, his voice low. "Some call him a philanthropist undone by a vengeful wife. Others finally call him what he is." Emily took a sip, the bitterness of the tea grounding her. "And which story do you think people will believe?" Julian's eyes softened. "They'll believe whichever story you have the courage to keep telling." Outside her home, cameras gathered like crows. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers carried down sidewalks. Emily had once lived quietly, content in her routines. Now her every step was observed, dissected, retold. She found herself avoiding windows, keeping to shadows. Yet in the stillness of her kitchen, as she washed dishes with hands trembling from exhaustion, she realized something. Fear was what Leonard wanted. Silence was his oldest weapon. That evening, she called Margaret. The older woman's voice crackled over the line, steady as ever. "They will try to shame you into retreat. Don't let them. You must speak. Not for the world, not even for the judge, for yourself." Emily closed her eyes. She thought of her child, of the world the baby would be born into. A world built on lies will only consume them both, she thought. A week later, Emily agreed to an interview. She sat in a modest studio, lights harsh and unkind, but her posture remained steady. The journalist, a woman with sharp eyes, asked questions with careful precision about Leonard's absences, his control of finances, his affair with Clara. Emily answered without embellishment. Her words were simple, each one drawn from wounds that had already scarred over. "I am not here to destroy him," she said quietly. "I am here to protect what remains of myself and what is coming into this world." When the interview aired, it spread quickly. Some scoffed, calling her dramatic, but many women reached out, messages of solidarity, stories of betrayal and survival. For the first time, Emily felt less alone. Leonard, of course, responded swiftly. He appeared on the steps of his foundation's office, cameras flashing, Clara at his side. His voice carried that practiced warmth, that veneer of nobility. "I will not speak ill of the mother of my child," he declared, smiling faintly, "but I will not allow falsehoods to stain the life we are building for this child." The crowd applauded. Reporters scribbled. The world had its two narratives again, two fires burning from opposite ends. Behind closed doors, Leonard grew ruthless. Emily's lawyer warned her of new motions filed, of attempts to freeze her accounts, discredit her testimony. Each paper that arrived in the mail felt like a stone hurled at her window. One night, unable to sleep, she stood by her balcony. The city lights stretched out like a map of battles she had yet to fight. Julian joined her, silent for a while before speaking. "You don't have to keep walking alone," he murmured. "I've been alone for so long," Emily replied. "Sometimes I wonder if I know any other way." Julian turned to her, his face etched with something unspoken. "Then let me remind you." For a moment, Emily looked at him, not as her ally, not as her shield, but as a man who had seen her at her weakest and still stayed. The thought both comforted and terrified her. The second hearing approached, heavier than the first. Emily spent nights preparing with her lawyer, combing through documents, reliving memories she wished she could bury. Every lie Leonard told had to be countered with truth. Every shadow met with light. The stress took its toll. Her body ached, her sleep fractured. One evening, as she folded baby clothes Margaret had given her, she felt a sharp pain ripple across her stomach. Panic flared, but the doctor assured her it was stress, nothing more. Still, Emily sat awake long after, whispering apologies to her unborn child. "I will not let him take you, I promise." The day before court, Julian drove her to the countryside for a reprieve. The fields stretched wide, the air carrying the scent of earth and rain. They walked slowly, Emily pausing often to rest. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" she asked, her voice soft. Julian looked at her, then at the horizon. "Every fight worth having will break you a little. but the ones that matter, they also build you back. Emily breathed in deeply, letting the wind brush against her skin. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. That night, she dreamed of fire. Not the consuming kind, but a fire that illuminated, that pushed back shadows. She saw herself standing in a courtroom, her voice unshaken, Leonard's mask crumbling. When she woke, the dream lingered like a promise. She rose from bed, placed her hands over her belly, and whispered, "Tomorrow we begin again." And though the storm ahead promised no mercy, Emily no longer feared the wind. The morning of the final hearing broke cold and gray, as if the sky itself carried the weight of what was to come. Emily stood before the mirror, smoothing the fabric of her modest dress. Her hands lingered over her stomach, now round and undeniable. The child shifted gently, a quiet reminder that she was not walking into the storm alone. Julian waited downstairs, his presence steady, grounding. "Ready?" he asked softly. Emily nodded, though the word ready felt like a fragile thing. She was not ready for the stares, the murmurs, the way Leonard's gaze would pierce through her across the courtroom. But she was ready for truth, and sometimes that was enough. The courtroom buzzed with energy when they arrived. Reporters lined the hallways, cameras flashing as if trying to capture the exact moment when one life ended and another began. Inside, Leonard sat with Clara at his side, both impeccably dressed, their faces composed into careful masks. When Emily entered, the air shifted. She felt eyes upon her, some curious, some sympathetic, others sharpened by doubt. She lowered her gaze, focusing only on the chair where she would sit, the papers clutched tightly in her hand. Her lawyer leaned in. "Stay steady. Today is ours if you can hold." Emily nodded, her heart beat loud in her ears. The proceedings began with Leonard's team. His lawyer spoke of betrayal, of a wife scorned and vengeful, painting Emily as unstable, consumed by jealousy. Clara dabbed her eyes with a tissue, as though grief-stricken by the cruelty of it all. The performance was immaculate, each line rehearsed to perfection. But Emily had lived with Leonard long enough to know that performances could not mask truth forever. When it was her turn, she rose slowly, her voice quiet but unwavering. She spoke of nights spent waiting, of accounts drained without her knowledge, of letters hidden, of her child growing within her while Leonard flaunted his life elsewhere. She presented documents, records of transfers, emails that contradicted his words, statements from staff he had once silenced. The room grew still. At one point, Leonard shifted, his jaw tightening. Clara's hand squeezed his, but Emily caught the flicker of fear in his eyes. It was the first crack in the mask. The judge listened intently, eyes scanning between the parties. Hours passed, each testimony a thread woven into the larger fabric of betrayal and truth. Finally, Julian was called. He testified not as a savior but as a witness, of the nights Emily had wept, of the times he had seen Leonard's cruelty unfold in subtle, cutting ways. His voice carried a quiet conviction that no wealth could purchase. When he stepped down, he passed Emily's chair, his hand brushing hers briefly. It was enough. Leonard was given one last chance to speak. He rose, his voice still smooth, still commanding. He spoke of reputation, of legacy, of how much he had given. He spoke of betrayal, not his own, but Emily's supposed betrayal of his trust. But the words no longer held power. The air was different now, the room less willing to be swayed. And when the judge delivered the verdict, the silence was deafening. Primary custody to Emily. Financial mismanagement confirmed. Leonard ordered to surrender assets he had hidden. Clara's face blanched. Leonard's hands trembled as he gripped the table. For once his voice failed him. Emily sat still, her breath shuddering out. She had not won everything, but she had won enough. Enough to protect her child. Enough to reclaim herself. Outside the courthouse, the world erupted, reporters shouting, cameras flashing. But Emily did not stop for them. Julian guided her through the chaos, his hand firm at her back. When they finally reached the car, she exhaled, the weight of months, perhaps years, leaving her shoulders. "Is it over?" she whispered. Julian met her gaze. "Not over, just beginning again." That night, Emily returned to the quiet of her home. Margaret came by with supper, fussing over her like a mother hen. They ate in silence, the warmth of food filling more than just their stomachs. Later, when the house was still, Emily stood by the window. The city stretched before her, lights flickering like stars that had fallen to earth. She thought of the woman she had been, silent, small, waiting always for permission to breathe. And she thought of the woman she had become. Her voice no longer borrowed, but wholly her own. She whispered to the child within her, "We're free." The words felt like a prayer. Weeks passed. The storm quieted, though the scars remained. Leonard faded from headlines, his empire weakened. Clara disappeared from view. Life did not become simple, but it became hers again. On a warm afternoon, Emily sat in the garden, Julian beside her, Margaret knitting nearby. The baby's kicks grew stronger, each one a promise of a future she once thought she'd never see. Julian leaned back, his eyes on the horizon. "Do you ever regret it, standing up, fighting like this?" Emily shook her head slowly. "No, the only regret I carry is waiting so long to begin." Julian smiled faintly, a softness in his expression she had come to know well. And in that moment, as the wind carried the scent of blooming flowers, Emily felt something she had not felt in years: hope. Her story was not one of triumph without wounds. It was a story of survival, of light returning after the longest night. She would carry the scars, yes, but also the strength that came with them. And when her child was born weeks later, with eyes that seemed to carry both pain and promise, Emily held them close and whispered, "You are my beginning." The world outside still whispered of betrayal, of wealth, of scandal, but inside Emily's arms there was only love, and the quiet certainty that she had endured the storm. And this was enough. So my friends, that's how Emily's story comes to a close. And if you're still here with me right now, maybe it's because something in her journey touched you. Maybe it reminded you of a time you had to stand back up when the world tried to silence you. Or maybe deep down, it whispered a truth you've always needed to hear. Scars are not the end. They are proof that you've survived. Remember this: no betrayal, no loss, no storm has the power to define your future. Only you do. Like Emily, you can walk through the fire and still carry hope in your arms. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Because maybe, just maybe, someone else out there needs this reminder tonight.